Sean Owens, student number 170283666, module code 6EDU1126. For the purpose of Part B of this assignment, I'll be providing a continual professional development session to the staff body at my school in the position of a science subject lead. The focus for my continual professional development session is based around the current issue of diversity and inclusion in science, with the overarching question being how can we increase children's awareness of diversity within primary science, with the aim of enabling our pupils to see science as something that, as MacDonald would say, is for people like me. The rationale behind my selection of this current issue is based upon both my personal experience as a female science learner, whereby I fell into one of the stated underrepresented groups in STEM fields, and as a result felt that I couldn't be a scientist because it was for the boys. And also as a result of my participation in the diversity seminar, the reflective journal for which you can see on the screen, with Dr. Alex Sinclair, within which I found a real interest in the need for change in order to increase diversity within science and inspire all of our students, especially those from the traditionally unrepresented groups, to aspire towards a science career. Hence why I've chosen to base my continuing professional development session on this current issue, with the aim of increasing my own professional understanding through research and enriching the practice of others through my informative training session. I shall now begin the continual professional development session. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's science-based continual professional development session. As you are all aware, I took a sample of each of your science books at the end of last half term, and overall I was really impressed with the work that's being done in science lessons across the school. But there was one particular topic that I'd like to address within this CPD session, which I believe to be of considerable importance to us as a school in ensuring that as many children as possible leave our school in year 6, carrying with them a positive opinion towards science, which they can then develop further at secondary and higher education levels. So today's session is going to be based around the question, how can we increase children's awareness of diversity in primary science? Now, to this day, I still remember my very first ever science seminar back when I was at university, where we were made to sit down, we were given a piece of paper and a pencil and one simple instruction, and that was draw a scientist. Now, I remember looking around the room and thinking, why are they asking us to do this? I came to university to learn how to teach and be a teacher, not to draw pictures. But when time was up and I looked around the room, and I saw that virtually all 80 of us had drawn this same man with his lab coat and his crazy hair and his glasses and his test tube. That was when it clicked. And I quickly realised that we have an issue here. And that's what they were trying to highlight to us from the very beginning. Now, these kinds of tests has been carried out by many different researchers and in schools across the country, all with a very similar response. The first study into scientist stereotypes was done by Mead and Matro back in 1957, with findings very similar to that of my drawing on the previous slide. Men wearing white lab coats, working in a lab and with glasses. This was then followed by Chambers, and Chambers was the first person to develop the Draw a Scientist test that we did at university when I was there a few years ago. And again, they found very similar findings. So they found a man, a white lab coat and glasses. Now, this was a really big study. There was 4,807 pupils, which increases the reliability of this study. It was then undertaken again by Karam more recently in 2016. Now, this was with 877 pupils. And despite the difference in time, he again found the same results. Now, this last study was done in Turkey, so it's not directly applicable to us, but in my opinion, this is still very relevant. And if anything, it shows a true size of the stereotype on a global scale, with it being consistent throughout different countries over time. Now, over the years, there have been many different reasons attributed to the science stereotype development, but one which I found particularly interesting was made by She. suggesting that the stereotype could arguably be a result of the media consumption and textbooks which contain highly stereotypical images of scientists and science. Now, interestingly, further research was carried out much more recently by Kerkhoven in 2016 into the gender distribution in educational online resources of different professions. Now, on the screen now, you can see a bar chart showing some of Kerkhoven's findings. Now, you can see on the left, it shows the percentage of men and women represented as being in the science professions, which, as you can see, there's a clear inequality between male and female representation. This is made even more clear when you look to the bar on the right, where you can see other professions not related to science having a distribution which is significantly more equal than that of the science profession. Now, Kerkhoven believes that this highlights the need for changes to create a balanced representation of men and women in science, and I'm sure many of us would be inclined to agree with him, including myself. However, it's important to remember that this issue is not just one of underrepresentation of women. Although MacDonald does state that the UK does have the lowest participation of women in the STEM workforce in Europe. So it is a real issue, but also with Black and minority ethnic and disadvantaged young people, we also have underrepresentation. With Archer, DeWitt and Osborne finding that Black students tended to express limited aspirations to careers in science due to this idea that science is less thinkable for Black students due to this underrepresentation in science careers and post-16 science courses. Now, one way Blickton staff and Archer, DeWitt and Osborne visualise this decline in participation is through the idea of a leaky science pipeline, where at regular intervals, participation from certain groups drops off. This occurs at post-16 education and again at university level, where many more girls, for example, leave the science pipeline than boys, and more Black and ethnic minority group students exit the pipeline too, due to this idea of science not being for people like me. Hence, this reflects the importance of our job as primary school teachers to make every young person, especially those from the underrepresented groups that I've described above, able to self-identify that science is for people like them. Now, our job is equally important, and especially important, as both Newton and later DeWitt and Archer recognised that stereotypes have been shown to develop early, hence requiring early intervention, and this is conducive with even more recent findings from Tyler and Turford, suggesting that by the age of 10, if children are not engaged in science, they are unlikely to ever engage in science in the future. Hence, our role is critical in developing this want to do science further in the future. This leads on naturally to the concept of science capital, which Tyler and Turford describe as a measure of how engaged someone is in science. Now, I am aware that we've previously discussed science capital as a whole, but I think it's important to revisit it in specific relation to tackling the current issue of diversity in science, as Godek, King and Archer state that the aim of science capital in itself is to help more diverse students engage with science. And of the 8 dimensions of science capital described by Godek, King and Archer, I'd like to draw our attention in particular to the science-related attitudes, values and disposition section. As where students struggle to see science as being relevant to them, it makes engagement much more difficult. Hence why we need to try to make it as relevant to their lives as possible in order to develop their science capital and increase their chance of aspiring to study science in the future. Now, even in the national curriculum, in the non-statutory notes section of the science curriculum, of the recommended scientists, there is a clear uneven distribution of both men and women, and white to Black or other ethnic minority groups represented. Now, I went through the national curriculum and I calculated the percentages of white male and white male scientists suggested to be used. It's not compulsory, but these are the suggested scientists. Now, of those, 94% were white, 88% were male, and 81% were white male. Now, Clegg suggests that we shouldn't be trying to rewrite history on the balance between men and women in science over the years, because prior to the 20th century, most major scientists were male. But whilst I agree with what Clegg is saying, I'd also be inclined to agree with Scholes and Stahl, who suggest the need for us to expand our pupils' visions of scientists by introducing them to a more diverse range of scientists, allowing our pupils to relate more readily to them. However, the way in which we decide to do this is very important. And this is reiterated by MacDonald, with the idea that one-off interventions do not work, and that instead, what is key is consistency. Hence, we can't just show a scientist from one of our underrepresented groups and that be successful in inspiring our pupils. Instead, I'd like to present to you a strategy that I would like us to introduce over a period of time into our science curriculum, which values consistency over immediacy. This strategy has been developed by Sinclair, Strachan and Shrew, and is based around linking famous scientists of the past, what they refer to as giant scientists or scientist giants, with modern day or contemporary scientists. Now you can see an example on the screen from their book, Walking on the Shoulders of Giants, where they've curated a document which details each year group and learning outcome with the content area and associated giant scientists, of which most are white male, as we have discovered, and a linked contemporary scientist who are of a far more diverse backgrounds. For example, here we can see in our year 2 topic of using everyday materials, they've linked John Loudon McAdam, who is a white male, with the contemporary female scientist, Julie Broussard, representing one of our underrepresented groups. Now, a similar strategy has also been trialled by Shinsky et al., where science spotlights were introduced, which were counter-stereotypical examples of scientists, and they found this to be a promising tool for enhancing science identity and shifting stereotypes in science, with students who took part displaying an enhanced ability to relate personally to scientists, and as MacDonald suggests, believe science is for me. Now, I am of the belief that by using this strategy, or a strategy similar to Sinclair, Strachan and Shrew, by linking famous scientists of the past to more diverse contemporary scientists, it could be beneficial not just in inspiring all of our students, but developing, in particular, the personalising and localising pillar of the science capital, where Godek, King and Archer suggest content is made personally relevant to their lives, but is also successful in having the additional positive impact of reinforcing the idea highlighted in the Ofsted Science Report, that science is open to revision in light of new evidence, as it could allow the students to visually see how an old science concept explored by one of our science giants is being used and revised in light of new evidence today by one of our linked contemporary scientists, and reiterating the idea, like Sinclair, Strachan and Shrew suggest, that scientific ideas change over time. Now, obviously, despite all the proposed benefits I've outlined to you of adopting this strategy to increase our pupils' awareness of diversity in science, I have also carefully considered some potential obstacles in the way of the implementation of this strategy. One potential obstacle of the implementation of this strategy could be the perceived increased workload for you, as individuals having to find contemporary scientists to link to our science giants for each of your topics. However, there's several ways that this could be overcome. My first suggestion is that as a collective, we each take responsibility for a limited number of contemporary scientists and collate an online document on the shared drive where all of the possible contemporary scientists that would be appropriate to certain topics and certain age groups can then be found and readily accessed, hence not increasing your workload dramatically. My second suggestion is to utilise the resources already available, such as the Standing on the Shoulders of Giants document by Sinclair, Strachan and True, where they've made an incredibly handy table linking scientists for you. However, you would need to establish whether the links are right for your children and make any adaptations you deem necessary. My third and final suggestion to battle the obstacle of an increased workload is that you do not need to completely replan your lessons. A simple readjustment may be all that's necessary to include your contemporary scientists alongside the science giant that you were already going to mention in that lesson and teach your children about. Hence, this should not be adding too heavily to your workload. On this next slide, I've listed some useful resources for considering diversity in primary science, one of which being a children's book called Superhero Scientists by Allen and Sinclair, which contains lots of contemporary scientist examples and those who utilise science skills within their jobs. So please do take the time to have a read through some of these documents to broaden your understanding of this current issue. So now, in terms of our next steps, we're going to spend the remainder of this CPD session today discussing the strategy introduced to you today, any concerns or thoughts you may have, as well as coming up with a plan of action for how we can indeed increase our pupils' awareness of diversity across primary science. If you have any questions, do come and ask. And I hope this has been informative and useful to you all and that you've all taken something away from it. Thank you for listening.